Matthew's gospel was written to a congregation of Jews and Gentiles, and when Jesus had been walking around town talking to his disciples and followers, there wouldn't have been a church. Jesus never organized Calvary Presbyterian Church of Nazareth. In his day, he and his followers were law-abiding Jews. He spoke in synagogues and he spoke on mountaintops, but to our knowledge, he never convened a committee meeting or ate a casserole at a potluck. The development of church didn't happen until after the crucifixion and resurrection, when his followers came together to keep alive the things they had heard from their teacher. This text shows that some concept of church has already developed between the time of Jesus and the time the Gospels are written down. The word translated as church in this passage is the word ekklesia, which means called out of. It is a term from Greek politics. It is the name of the assembly of citizens who came together to vote for magistrates, to declare war, to do the work of the government. So early on, what we now call church took its name from the idea that people who come together can effect change. An ecclesia is a group of people who make a difference in their world by working together. There were plenty of other words that could have been used to describe a religious gathering, but the early church mothers and fathers picked a political one. For Jesus to call on the ecclesia, on the assembly, is a sign that the church has never been just about a building. It's about people who have a job to do. Matthew, by including this in his narrative of Jesus' story, is addressing a need of Matthew's congregation and of ours, namely, why does it matter that we gather together, virtually for now, as church and do this hard work of getting along? Why are we here? Why do we set aside time in our busy lives to be church? And what kind of change does God want us to be a part of? It's messy. And it can be complicated, and Jesus doesn't pretend it should be any other way. The Greek text really begins like this: not if, but when a brother sins against you, which means that Jesus doesn't mess around with some idea of perfection in the church. He doesn't say, now that you are church, I know that all discord will cease and everyone will live together in harmony. What Jesus says is, when this happens, often we get disgusted with church because we think all of those disputes that mess up our life shouldn't happen here. And I suspect you have heard something to the effect of, I stopped going to fill in the blank church because people didn't always get along and they call themselves Christians. As Christians, even though we can't be perfect, we are called to a different standard. There is a sense that by taking up our crosses and following him, we are signing on for something different than the same old, same old. So disagreements will happen, but the next part is where it gets fun. At that point, Jesus says we're supposed to go talk to the person with whom we're in a disagreement. Our call in this text is to talk to each other face to face. Granted, that's a little more challenging in the age of COVID. But we trust that Jesus would adapt his advice today to be mask to mask at an appropriate distance outdoors. Jesus would not, however, adapt the advice to tell us to insult strangers on Facebook with a comment on their post. Working out our disagreements with the face of the person in front of us, however we can do that safely, is, I think, to remind us to see the divine image in the person with whom we disagree, giving each other the respect that each person deserves as a beloved child of God who has been called to be part of the church. Paul phrases it this way in the letter to the Romans: why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister, or why do you despise your brother or sister? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For Paul, the awareness that God's going to judge everyone ought to help the rest of us stand down from our need to judge. God's got this, says Paul. While both passages come at the topic differently, ultimately they both call us to compassion and to understanding for our fellow people. It's worth noting that this passage about church discipline is in the middle of a larger passage about forgiveness and restoration. Church discipline is not about punishing people. It's about restoring them. And I think when we hear, let that person be to you as a tax collector, we hear that as a sign that we should write them off, as if they are people outside of our family. But Jesus, in this gospel and in others, has the bad habit of hanging out with people like tax collectors, people whom society tells him he shouldn't fraternize because they were outside the family. Tax collectors, Gentiles, lepers, women, heaven forbid, you name it, Jesus goes to their home for dinner, and Jesus invites them to hang out with him. So when Jesus tells us to consider that person to be a tax collector or a Gentile, perhaps what he's saying to us is this: consider that person to be the biggest illustration you can imagine of someone who needs to be brought into my family. Consider that person to be exactly the person that you need to keep seeking out, because my family won't be complete without them or without you. We don't have to let everybody get away with all their bad behavior. There are still codes of behavior and standards that matter. But we never reach a point where we stop seeking reconciliation. And then Peter, trying to figure out exactly how long it will take us to get along, asks Jesus, "How many times, Lord, must I forgive someone? As many as 7 times?" And Jesus, to make sure that we understand that forgiveness is about redemption and restoration, says, "No, Peter, not 7 times, but 77 times. Jesus throws out numbers so big that the message is this: forgiveness can't be quantified. We're supposed to stay together, to keep working at it until we get it right. And when that happens, and there are moments when it does, glimpses of God's kingdom, then listen to Jesus' words. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And if 2 or 3 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven." That's the reason we go and talk to each other face to face, because when we can come together, we don't just change things on earth, we change things in heaven. So we keep working at it 77 times because it is that important to us, and it is that important to God. After Peter's questions about forgiveness, there's a parable, and it's kind of awful in its starkness. A ruler rightly plans to sell a slave and his wife and children in order to pay off a debt that the slave owes. It's a big debt. 1 talent is the wages of a laborer for 10 years. So this man owes 10,000 worth of 10 years' salary. It's a debt a slave could never repay. And the slave begs for mercy, and the owner erases the debt. So far, so good. But then that slave encounters a man who had owed him a few $100, a minor debt, and he grabs him by the throat, and he demands that money, and he hauls him off to jail. As he has received mercy, he instead responds with physical violence and a cruel kind of justice. Yes, it's true the man owed him money, but it doesn't seem just, does it, in light of what has just been forgiven him? How often do we do that? We accept grace that forgives our sins, and we turn around and judge and condemn everybody else's sin, as if somehow our debt had never needed to be paid. The slave owner who had relieved the huge debt hears about this cruelty, and he loses his ever-loving mind, and he unforgives the debt and hands the man over to be tortured. So much for that 77 times we're supposed to forgive. With parables, it's always tempting to cast ourselves as the good guy in the story, and we're usually wrong when we do that, but it's tempting also to cast people we don't really like as the bad guys in the parable. Oh, that unforgiving servant is just like fill in the blank on the news. When we do that, we're often missing the way that parable applies to our own lives. But here, I'm not really sure who the good guy is in this parable. Is it the slave owner who first forgives the debt, but then unforgives it and sends him off to be tortured? It's clearly not the guy who had his debt forgiven and then couldn't forgive somebody else. It's hard to see where God is in this parable for me, too, because the depth and height and breadth of God's love seems big enough to forgive 10,000 talents. But it's harder to know what to do with the Lord who hands someone over to be tortured. The parable reminds me that God's ways are not our ways, and whenever we think we know who God really is, and when God likes all the same people we do, we've made God in our image and not the other way around. And maybe forgiveness, or the lack thereof, is the one thing that really gets God good and fired up. Because everything we said about forgiveness earlier, about how it matters for community, how it looses things on heaven and on earth and in heaven, it's the whole enchilada. If we can't figure out how to forgive each other, how could we possibly be able to receive God's grace and forgiveness? Or maybe it's the other way around. If we can't recognize the gift of forgiveness that we've already received, how will we ever be able to forgive someone else? Perhaps the Lord in this parable isn't the one taking back forgiveness of the ungrateful slave. Maybe the slave does that all by himself. But we can't truly know what it is to be forgiven people until we become forgiving people. Corrie ten Boom was a writer and a speaker who talked to people about her faith and about forgiveness, and she and her sister Betsy had been arrested for concealing Jews in their home in Holland during World War II. They were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp for their crime. In 1947, she was speaking to a group of Germans about God's forgiveness and about how forgiveness was even for them. And after the talk, a man came up to her. He had been a guard at Ravensbrück. And many years later, she wrote this story. Now, he was in front of me with his hand thrust out. "A fine message, Fraulein. How good it is to know, as you say, that all our sins are at the bottom of the sea." And I, who had spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take his hand. He would not remember me, of course. How could he remember one prisoner among those thousands of women? But I remembered him and the leather crop swinging from his belt. It was the first time since my release that I had been face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. "You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk," he was saying. "I was a guard there." No, he did not remember me, she wrote. "But since that time," the man went on, "I have become a Christian, and I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well, Fraulein." Again the hand came out. "Will you forgive me?" And I stood there, I whose sins had every day to be forgiven, she writes, and I could not. My sister Betsy had died in that place. How could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out, but to me it seemed hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I'd ever had to do. For I knew I had to do it. I knew it not only as a commandment of God, but as a daily experience. Since the end of the war, I had had a home in Holland for victims of Nazi brutality, and those who were able to forgive their former enemies were able also to return to the outside world and to rebuild their lives, no matter their physical scars. But those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and as horrible as that. And still I stood there with the coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. She prayed for Jesus to help her, and she offered her hand to that former Nazi prison guard in forgiveness, and she was the one transformed by the act. Her story reminds us of the cost of forgiveness. We have to let go of the reasons for our anger and our hurt, and those reasons may be perfectly legitimate and understandable, and nobody would have judged her for not wanting to take the hand of the Nazi who subjected her to such cruelty. But the question for us is, do we want to be right, or do we want to be in relationship? Maybe to recognize the grace we've received, we have to participate in it. So she forgave the Nazi prison guard his 100 denarii debt so that she could live into her 10,000 talent debt that had already been relieved. The Nazi still had his own journey toward grace and forgiveness, and it isn't clear, quite frankly, from her story if he had been changed. But in truth, changing him wasn't her job. This is where that passage from Romans comes in. Why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. God does not call us to fix other people, sadly. God calls us to tend to our own spirits and to not carry around hatred and resentment. God calls us to work it out with each other so that we can be church. Being church is about being forgiving and forgiven people. So this week, I invite you to think about whether or not you are able to accept God's forgiveness in your own life. It begins there. Whatever you have done, take it to God. Nothing is beyond God's ability to redeem and restore. There may be amends you need to make, but nothing we do is beyond God and God's desire to be in relationship with us and God's desire for us to be in relationship with each other. Next, consider whose forgiveness do you need? Who needs a phone call or a visit from you so that your relationship may be restored? What do you need to do to work at a relationship that matters to you? And then, who do you need to forgive? What is required for that relationship to be healed? We can't force other people to do their part, but we don't have to hang on to our own resentment and anger. Some people don't want restoration, of course, and some don't want to do the work to get there. And Jesus said, remember, if a member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let that one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. He sends us back again toward that relationship piece. Reverend Jennifer Marci wrote for the Presbyterian Outlook last year about how we treat people who don't want to do the work of being in relationship with us. She writes, I think of Jesus and how he interacted with the tax collectors and the Pharisees and the prostitutes of his day. They were the ones whose minds and lives Jesus wanted to change, and he did it by sticking close to them, by eating with them, by sharing in life with them. They didn't have to cease and desist their behaviors before he would spend his time with them. He met them where they were, and he was present with them, and he heard them. Not even Jesus changed everyone's minds, for the record. We don't stick close to people so that we'll win. We stick close to them because relationships matter, even when we disagree. How might relationships come to be restored if we could stick close together, sharing in life with each other, participating in the grace that has saved us? May the love and forgiveness that we loose on earth be loosed in heaven too. I look forward to being church here with you. Amen.